going into things with the ability to say, I'm here to learn and I'm here to absorb, I'm here to observe. And from that, I'll learn how best to work with you.
Welcome to the Smart Talk series, the show for professionals who want strategies, tips, and real talk about all things PR, marketing, and social media. Your host is Melissa Vella Williamson, an award-winning, accredited, and nationally recognized PR pro and communication thought leader. And now your host, Melissa Vella Williamson.
Hello and welcome to the Smart Talk series. I'm Melissa Vella Williamson. This season, our focus is on cultural strategy. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Marin. Daniel is the Executive Director of Public Relations for the FIFA World Cup 2026, where he leads all communication strategies for what will be the biggest sporting event in history. For 2 decades, Daniel has held a range of comms roles within some of the biggest brands around, from UPS to Netflix, and most recently led communications for Amazon's Prime Video division across Latin America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. He's a native of Miami, Florida, where he currently resides and holds an MBA from Florida International University. Welcome, Danny.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited you're here. I barely feel worthy. So let's talk about your career. Tell us about your background. How'd you get in PR? What are you doing today?
Wow, those early days. I was actually an ad major when I was in my undergrad. Always had a bit of a creative streak, but never took much to somebody directing my art. So I kind of shifted the focus more into communications. And thanks to my wife, who suggested I take a PR class 101, basically fell in love with it, never looked back, and was just fortunate to start in a boutique public affairs agency while I was still in school. So I was working and learning at the same time. And it just put me on the path that kind of got me to where I'm at today.
Awesome. And shout out to your wife for guiding you the way to PR. A lot of us in our professional careers, I keep hearing the same kind of connection point, Danny, that a lot of us maybe just kind of fell into it and then fell in love with it. So I love that that was your path as well. So, I mean, today you're directing public relations for the world's premier international football competition. And here in the US, right, we call it soccer, but it's said to be the world's most popular sport. How does that feel? And what do you think makes soccer or football so popular?
I mean, as far as feelings, with a description like that, I think you can maybe assume it's humbling. I feel privileged, lucky to be in this position to be a part of this. It's a world moment, and I think anybody who's embarked, in a professional career like ours, just on the executive side, this is kind of what, even if you don't admit it, it's what you're working toward, to be a part of something that's ubiquitous. In football, soccer, whatever your terminology is, it's just the accessibility, I'd say. To play it, all you need is a ball. It's something that I think, it's kind of a level playing field, if you will, around the world. So it's very easy to play, and from there, very easy to fall in love with. But even the aspects of folks that don't like to play, watching can just be as exhilarating. It's a culture unto itself. The cheers, the chants, the clubs, the barra bravas, in parts of the world, the hooligan is, it's just something that people embrace to their own degree. And I really think that's something that, kind of permeates. It's why not spend an afternoon watching a match, with friends, with family, creating traditions, which is exactly what kind of, pulled me in a long time ago, specifically with the World Cup. So, this has kind of come full circle for me.
Yeah, absolutely. My son has really got into soccer, as we're, I guess, more comfortable calling it here. But I've actually heard him, Danny, use the word football the other day. And I'm like, American football or European football? And he's like, oh no, soccer. I'm like, okay, which is really cool because he's about 10 years old and he's been playing since he was 6. And shout out to Logan because I know he'll listen to this episode because you're on it, Danny. And he's so cute. One thing they did in his school we were talking about before the show started was they have a musical every year. and they do a performance during a PTA meeting for parents. And it must have been in first or second grade. I wrote a column about this for my PRSA cultural strategy column about how the musical was actually about soccer. And within one of the songs, they kept going back and forth about soccer, football, soccer, football. And the last line was like, who cares? Let's just play. And I think to your point about accessibility, that is kind of the point, right? It brings a lot of people together because no matter what you want to call it, you don't need a lot to just get out there and play. And there's something about, not being able to use your hands and kicking it around that I think is really attractive to a lot of folks too. But you're right. Like each game, like I'm really interested in pop culture in terms of how it brings people, no matter their background or demographics or what our stereotypes are about them. Like it crosses over and it becomes its own culture. Like, how do you behave at a match? Like you said, right? Not a game. And in San Antonio, we got our San Antonio football club here a few years ago. And when I went to my first match, it kind of blew my mind because I was used to seeing like 9-year-old, 10-year-olds kicking the ball around and, getting kind of far down the field, but not far. But boy, when the professional soccer players are playing, like one kick and the field, like the ball's across the whole entire field. It was incredible. And then, yeah, there's drums and there's, I don't know what is in the air, like what is that, Danny? Powder? Like they're like colored smoke?
Yeah, they cut smoke for the team colors. There's the face paint, and that's you kind of hit another thing. It's in person is a totally different experience.
Absolutely.
Watching on TV, like the last World Cup, last match, it was in PKs, and I was in a room packed with friends, family, knowing half of them really did not have much skin in the game. They weren't like avid fans or anything, but the breath in the room would go out just before each player would take a kick to see what the reaction was. And it didn't matter if you have a love of the game or not, you were in that moment, and so in person or just on a TV, it has that ability to draw you in.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the kick too that you feel like, well, I could probably do that, right? It's different than like, slam dunking a ball. It's a little different. I'm like, I think I could kick that, and we've been watching some of the matches here with Copa America and whatnot, and like seeing the getting down to just penalty kicks because no one scored during the official game time. And you're like, oh man, the pressure is it's just really, I think there's a one word for it in my mind. It's cool. Soccer's really cool. Like the haircuts are cool, the players look cool. Like it's really cool. So
That's a good word.
yeah, I think that's why it's part of why it's popular, right? We all want to be cool. Well, let's talk about what you're doing and getting ready for. So the FIFA World Cup 2026 will return, and I read this from a sports writer, for the first time in 3 countries and for the first time with 48 teams. And it is said to be quite the event. I imagine you're probably even now managing lots of media inquiries and a lot more. So how do you approach managing external communications for this?
Yeah, no pressure, right?
No pressure at all. Give me some tickets.
It's funny. My first introduction to working in the field of sports was when I was still at Prime Video in the entertainment space, way back when we first launched Thursday Night Football, and that was my first opportunity to work with some sports press, both domestic, international. The number one thing that stood out was just the emotional drive behind everything, behind their questions. It really looked as if these journalists were representative of their audience and readership, and basically just the things that they cared about. So it was an interesting slide into these journalists are just as much fanatics, in terms of teams or the sport or whatever the championships were. And it was just an interesting pivot, having been in, having worked in tech or even in legal and stuff. I had never had to really account for somebody's degree of passion before like that. I've always tried to keep that, especially in entertainment, which is driven by taste. But coming into the sports world, once you have that, you need to understand that just about anything can pretty much generate a news cycle, because while it may not seem important, to an individual or one person in a particular place, it might be important to the audience. It might be important to that one member, that one reader, that one viewer. Um, so that being said, it's trying to just be as responsive as possible, and that means putting the resources in place, factoring in that if you have what is the world's sport, you're also in an environment that's both global and 24 hours. And so you have to think through that. You have to think through that and when to announce things. You have to think through that and when to take, questions, how to make yourself available. So it's really just putting an infrastructure in place that can really be responsive and be responsive to both a global audience, but also a global network of press.
And does that start for you? Because I think part of me was intrigued when and congratulations, by the way, of you getting that new role on LinkedIn. And I thought, okay, 2026, it's 2024. How does this work? Does like a new team come in for each, I guess, FIFA World Cup? And it's almost like a campaign, right? Well, it is a campaign. It's almost like a election cycle or something where there's a time list to it. Does a new crew come in and you set up, and for the next few years, you're working towards this, you know, this journey, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's well, fortunately, the World Cup has been around for quite some time, so
Yeah.
they've got their ducks in a row, if you will. But it does kind of speak to a little bit of how in your intro about cultural strategy. Um, this is an organization that appreciates the nuances, the local level of anywhere the game is played. And so the approach now is really, where are the tournaments taking place and how can we get local experts in place to help us adapt whatever we need? In other words, how do we communicate a global vision, to a local audience? And how do we also account for their needs, their perspectives, their cultures, if you will? So the team is brought together to produce what is this global moment, so that we're maximizing, the reach, so that it's as accessible as possible. It's this is in addition to the 48 teams, that makes it the most diverse World Cup in history. So it's putting folks that have that capacity, if you will, and the understanding, the international IQ, so that we're trying to bring this tournament to everyone, but at a local level, also giving it, both the care and importance that it needs.
I love that because a big part of cultural strategy is, like you're saying, is to understand each community's needs, preferences, how they communicate, and what they're looking for. And like you said before, because this is all kind of mixed with emotion and passion, which can, run hot and cold sometimes in our PR world, right? So there's a lot to think about, and localizing that approach and working with local experts and communication pros is probably a smart way to go. When we're talking about tailoring, Danny, I definitely want to talk about how we communicate. And sometimes that boils down to just pure language, right? So, what role does utilizing English and Spanish language play in the work you're doing?
It's at the core, in terms of being bilingual has definitely been an advantage, for me, and I will really emphasize that point for anybody, that wants to go in any sort of communications role and beyond. If you have the ability, or you've been privileged enough to be raised, with two languages, utilize that as much as possible and develop it as strongly as you can, because it really is only going to make you more effective. For what I do, English and Spanish really just helps double the audience that I can reach. It helps me basically become a conduit for, maybe an English speaking organization and helping them reach local customers, local audiences. That ability to speak in two languages. And believe me, I work with folks that can speak with more, and I'm quite envious. But it just really adds to the value that you can bring to the table. And it really does expand your impact, the reach of what you can do. And if it's, a message that you're getting out there, it really just allows you to get to an even broader audience. And, organizations value that. So definitely being bilingual is something that, has helped me get to where I'm at. And it's something that really helps maximize, the impact of my work.
I love that you mentioned all of that. And I just wrote down the word advantage and double. And I'll tell you why, because in my career, and especially a lot of the work that I've been doing the last few years to really elevate and invite and equip more pros of color into public relations and professional communications work, as well as those from the Latino or Hispanic cultures to come into the profession. One thing I've heard in a number of different ways was that, oh, I like a feeling of less worthy or imposter syndrome because of an accent, or because English is not my first language, or because I am bilingual. And it pull part of me wants to pull my hair because I'm like, you are doubly important. You are so much more important than me, who really understands some Spanish but can't speak it because of, right, how my parents were brought up in South Texas, and that you don't speak Spanish. And we were kind of silenced out of the language for about a generation. But if you do speak it, oh my goodness, right? Double the audience, double the reach, like you said, Danny, double the impact, and hopefully double the money. So I just want to encourage everyone who has a gift of being able to speak more than one language and can make time to work on that proficiency to please embrace it and be proud of it, because like you mentioned, it's such an asset.
If I can add to that,
Yeah, please.
just because I know there's scenarios where folks they feel their Spanish is not strong enough, their second language is not strong enough. Because to your point, in the household it was spoken, but when you leave, it was something that maybe wasn't as accessible or utilized. Growing up in Miami, that was never the case. You had plenty of opportunities to practice your Spanish. When I moved out west, I realized that was quite different for folks that grew up, in that part of the country. But my Spanish was not great, in terms of growing up. So another shout out to my wife who helped develop that. She's from Venezuela, and it was something where I was able to accelerate it just from practicing with her family, and then just in really diving into an international role that also allowed me to practice on a daily basis. So my ability to communicate has only improved with time, but with commitment, with constant
Right.
practice, and really putting in the time to understand, business terms and other points, like supply chain, things like that. Like those are not things that you learn when you're trying to learn colors and animals and things like that in two languages and stuff. So it does take commitment. But anybody that applies themselves, I guarantee can get to a place where they really can make an impact, in two languages.
Yeah, I really want to work on that. I have kind of gotten to where I think I feel very comfortable that, okay, it's clear that I'm proficient in my professional aspects of my job to a certain extent, right? I've been working on my accreditation, my APR, NPR, and I just got the great news that I am going to be inducted in the PRC College of Fellows. So I'm like, okay, Melissa, PR. Let's go back to Spanish and let's focus on that. So
Congratulations.
a
That's great.
personal goal of mine. Thank you. And what's really cool, and I also want to highlight for everyone, is that to your point, it's not, English and Spanish are very dominant across the world. They're two great languages to get very proficient at and talk with people through in a number of ways. But another one that we could consider, for example, is, my daughter is learning, she's almost 15. My daughter is learning American Sign Language, and she's telling me, hey, Mom, I think I want to be a sign language interpreter. And of course, my heart's like, but you'd be so great for public relations, and let's see how they intersect. Let's do them both. And we were having this debate, Danny, the other day. I was actually driving her to a special workshop that they were doing at her aerials acrobatics type school. And Ringling Brothers was coming by and they were going to do a workshop. And we were talking about career. I'm always talking about career stuff. And I said, oh, Amelia, I really think you can intersect sign language with PR. Like, how cool is that? I really don't know anyone who's bilingual in that way. And it open you up to a lot of different audiences and people. And of course, you can do theater. You can do everything with it, right? And she's like, oh, Mom, right? At that oh, Mom moment. And then we get to the event. And at the end of the event, I meet the PR manager, Brandon, for Ringling. And I mentioned to him, yada yada, my daughter, and I mentioned that she is interested in being an ASL interpreter, but also I want her to learn the principles of PR, and because that's part of all we do. And he's like, "You're kidding." He's like, "I'm an ASL interpreter." So he turns to my daughter and he says, "Can you have a conversation?" And she said, "Yeah." And so they have a full-blown little conversation in sign language. And I just like started crying a little bit. I was like, wow. And I'm like, Amelia, see, you can speak in American Sign Language, you can and work in PR and do it all. So I just wanted to highlight that languages really extend, to your point, the capacity we have in a lot of ways as people.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story.
I want to talk about a little bit back. I want to go a little back and look at your work at Netflix. At Netflix, your focus there included Latin America. And then at Amazon, you built upon that by broadening to also cover Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So, can you tell us how you approach communicating with such diverse cultural groups?
Yeah, it's the term that I used a little earlier. It's the international IQ is kind of the way that I branded it. And I get kind of preachy when especially working with the younger folks that are falling into the industry. Especially for anyone that wants to make the leap and work, cross border, either on a project basis or if they've already identified that that's their trajectory. And when I tell people have an international IQ, it's I don't make the assumption that everybody has the ability to travel and get out there and see the world and such. And that's a crime, but that's just the reality, of where we're at. But that doesn't mean that you're not able to fire up, the internet, and actually just dive deep into specific cultures and parts of the world that you're going to be engaging with. If somebody told you, you have a teammate from this country or from this part of the country, you're likely going to ask probing questions and just to get a sense of like, well, what's it like there? In other words, what are the differences? What are the commonalities? People can proactively do that on their own. I mean, we're blessed to be in a day and age where information is at our fingertips. It's coming at us, even if we don't want it to. So it's the information is out there. You just have to really put in the work to learn a little bit about it. And even if it's fundamental, so I'd say that's one piece of it. The other piece is when you do finally get the chance to engage with people, it's be open. Go into it with the humility that you don't know everything. You don't know everything about their culture, their experience, the way things work. In terms of communications or any other aspect of business. It's one thing to know or have a very good footing, of your position, your organization, domestically. But the minute you're a representative going international, kind of going in saying, well, this is how we do it here, that's just not going to work. When I first started working with Latin America, it was quite, obvious to me that their ways of working were completely different. They weren't as nervous, if you will, like you find in a lot of, American or US based, business setups. From a culture standpoint, everybody's in a hurry, deadline, trying to get to this, trying to get to that. For Latin America, I actually admired the fact that folks put a little bit more of, their personal lives first. They were working to live, not living to work, was how it was put to me one time. And I've taken from that. It's made me empathetic. It's really allowed me to expand my emotional IQ in that regard, both as a manager, as a colleague, hopefully as a friend as well. But all of this just going into things with the ability to say, I'm here to learn and I'm here to absorb, I'm here to observe. And from that, I'll learn how best to work with you. It's kind of the best advice I can give anyone, and it's served me well.
No, I love that. I love having that international IQ. And I think just making the effort, like you're saying, is, we can do our own research before we meet and speak with anyone. We can ask politely and we can take notes, and so that we don't have to ask again. But listening's a big deal, and a lot of people don't do that. And then iterating our approach based on all that knowledge is really important. And I think if you have a gentle curiosity where you're not being forceful and this is how we do it and why do you do this, but it's really that there's a real big difference between why versus like, oh, why, right? That I think that it brings people together with that understanding of, I want to work with you, we want to make it better, and we want to connect. So I think that really matters in the ways you're saying that, Danny. Thank you.
And to add to the why, it's okay for managers to basically say, well, how would you do it? And kind of put that open-ended question out there. And you'd find quite quick, that folks can give you a straight answer of why this would work, why it wouldn't work. So you have to be open to that versus going in by saying I am where I am because of my success and past decisions and whatnot. When you cross borders, you're in uncharted territory on a personal level. And so you should be deferring to a local expert or a cultural expert that can at least help guide you. And then the last piece I'd say is pass it on. Experience and anecdotes are something that help others who are, early in their journeys understand, what they're getting themselves into so that they have the right, kind of mentality in saying, well, I definitely want to work on an international basis, but now I realize I have to flip the switch on a certain thing. In my approach in connecting with stakeholders or just with colleagues.
Yeah, passing on that, what you've learned is really, really important, I think, for us to advance ourselves, our profession, our communities. I think it's a really good tip that you're sharing. So, Danny, I really appreciate that you've worked on both the external and internal side of communications in your career. What have you found are the commonalities and the differences between those two vantage points?
Um, I'd say commonalities is just the general, I guess, output for communications, and it's the value. In terms of speaking to audiences internally or externally, you have to adapt both your mechanism for delivery as well as the language, and but the subject matter, it always needs to land. So if you work back from these audiences and you're able to just craft, what you're doing, I'd say it's pretty consistent. When you're going broad and external, or when you're going internal, you have to really just fine tune what you're trying to say, how you're trying to say it, and how you're trying to get that information out there. I'd say that's very, pretty consistent between the two. Big difference, is maybe just how long the information stays relevant or valuable. Internal audiences, I've always found, they take those types of communications, they reference them, they become, kind of like footnotes in conversations, and they're really able to linger. Externally, not so much. We're just in an environment where news cycles are, if not daily, hourly. And unfortunately, the impact of communicating externally, it's just not what it used to be, just because of the amount of competition, competition for information, for attention. So that tends to be, kind of a challenge that I don't see as prevalent, for internal communications.
But you bring up a brilliant point that internal audiences, your employees, your internal stakeholders, those closest to your organization, what you communicate with them is going to be stickier. It's going to be more relevant. It's going to last longer. And then they can become your brand ambassadors or your brand champions. They can become, in some ways, an extension of the communication department by sharing the same kind of messaging and talking points and footnotes, as you called them, with others for a longer amount of time, which really underscores the point that it's important that we equip our internal audiences, our employees, our internal stakeholders with the right messaging and information from the get-go. Having worked in internal communications and a lot in external communications, I find that a lot of times I have to advise clients and remind them, hey, start with your employees. Let them know what's going on first so they can actually help you in communicating what you need to communicate. And so I love that you bring that up because it is more relevant and it can have longer legs in this way. I mean, I'm sure we could
Oh.
talk about this all day, but do you have any last tips on cultural strategy you could leave us with?
Um, I'd say the goes back to the international IQ. As I said, I get pretty preachy. So when it comes to cultural strategy, it's really just surrender, yourself, your perspective, to that local nuance. It's out of your control. It's a big world, and everything works differently all around it. And it's okay to come into situations with a degree of expertise and successful, past successes, if you will. that can help, kind of drive your mindset around things. But you have to really give that local nuance a chance, and you have to see how best to understand it versus trying to circumvent it, or just basically trying to control it, because that might work here and there, but for the long term, and especially if you're trying to make a career on an international stage, it's just not really sustainable. So I'd just say anybody wanting to get out there in an international capacity, it's kind of go into it as an empty cup, and the longer you're at it, the more the cup gets filled.
I love that. And, I think at some points in my career, I've talked about that I'm a little like a chameleon, like depending on the situation, the audience, the vibe in the room, how I need to project myself, like I will kind of shift, right? My approach and my even my dress and how I may speak with someone, or, what are the cultural norms in terms of handshakes or greetings, right? And to your point about surrendering, I really appreciate that because there has to be a real humbleness about this, like you've been mentioning, to localize and really work with the nuances and the cultural preferences of others. It's to really say, here are the resources I have, and here's what we can offer, but how should we best do that work here? How should we best communicate this here? What's really going to land or hit? And I love that about what we're doing. If we can really think about how we all are kind of universal in that we want to know important information, we want to be kept up with things, we want to be seen as cool. And FIFA has all that it can offer, I'm sure. But we were even talking, Danny, before we started about pronunciations of names and how we like to be referred to. And one point that we were making is like, you know what? In some ways, like for me, I don't even care if you're more comfortable calling me Melissa or Melissa. As long as we're communicating, I'm happy. And sometimes I think with your approach, that's kind of a really good metaphor for that, right?
Yeah, but also don't be afraid to butcher someone's name in an attempt to learn how to correctly say it. I've learned that over
Yeah.
years.
Ask
But yeah, yeah,
nicely.
ask nicely. No, and to that point, I mean, it is important to to bring your true self, and it is important for somebody to not subdue their personality, in the face of everything else, but understand things need to coexist. And the way to do that is by learning, to your point, how do you have to dress in a given situation,
Mhm.
and I say that as someone that, having gone through a lot of different, companies and corporate cultures, I was wearing suits every day in one instance, and most recently, I was wearing ripped jeans, to work and such. So, the environment should drive your interaction, but that means you have to really learn, put yourself in there to understand it, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, great, great advice because we want to acculturate and bring our authentic selves to what we're doing, but grabbing on pieces of the culture that kind of makes sense for the scenario and the situation. And that's where that concept of tailoring comes in, or this international IQ, right? We're kind of picking up on that and getting smarter with our approach.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Danny, this has been awesome. And I love asking all my guests because I'm really trying to champion something in our community here of communicators. But what does smart talk mean to you?
Yeah, you'd shared that previous, and I did actually dive in. My takeaway is just communicating with intention. I think this day and age, because of social media, because of this people's ability to reach mass audiences, they don't put as much thought into what they're saying, whether the impact, the potential for misunderstanding. In other words, they don't take into account how a receiving audience might interpret something. Um, so communicating with intention, that means you take a second, you hold a beat and basically ask yourself, does this need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? And does it need to be said by me now? To quote a comedian. And it's really just giving yourself the time, to think through, will this information impact somebody, and will that impact have value? Will it offend? Will it basically have the intended, consequence that I'm hoping. But that takes time. That really means just not saying the first thing that comes out of your mouth. So smart talk for me is really just that, communicating with intention, so that whoever is listening, understands that you have put the thought into what you're saying, and it's worth listening to.
I really value that. And I think with your point about international audiences, that intention's gonna go a long, long way. Well, Danny, this has been delightful, and I'm super excited for FIFA 2026. In the meantime, what's the best way for listeners to connect with you if they want to learn more?
LinkedIn, it's been the social platform that I've enjoyed most, and I tend to be pretty receptive there. So anybody wanting to reach out, I'm on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Danny, for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
No, appreciate you having me. Really just thankful for the opportunity, Melissa.
Thanks to our listeners for joining me for today's episode. If you like Smart Talk and strategic comms, let's collaborate. You can work with me as a trainer, a consultant, or hire my firm, MVW Communications, for strategic comms planning or PR strategy services. My book, Smart Talk, Public Relations Essentials All Pros Should Know, is available on Amazon in print or audio and offers advice, how-to tips, tools, and new PR models so aspiring and practicing pros are equipped for this evolving field. Please follow and rate this podcast if you're a fan, and follow us at MVW to get the latest on trends, trainings, and more. And as always, think smart and communicate smart. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Smart Talk series. If you learned something or enjoyed our conversation, share it on social media or send to a friend. To learn more about this and other communication topics, visit mvw360.com. That's mvw360.com.